Hello everyone, in this video we're going to get started on a three-part series dedicated to the 172, the lovely Cessna itself, the one that everybody thinks of when they used to think about Microsoft Flight Simulator, the lovely Skyhawk. In this three-part series, of course, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be kind of going down through this airplane, kind of nut by nut, bolt by bolt, rivet by rivet, kind of discussing what it is to fly it, some of its kind of handling quirks, and just some general things to know about the plane and my experiences inside of it. So let's get started. So my first experience with a Cessna 172 was actually a Cessna 172N back in 2009. This aircraft was a neat little airplane. Of course, it was a product of the 1970s as opposed to a product of 1998 like the S model we have here. And I just remember basically climbing to the front seat just like this. I was over here on the right, and it was a 733 Yankee Romeo was the particular plane they are in. The person over here, a really neat guy, offered to take us around so we could do some video work on it. And I remember being so fascinated by how goofy the yoke looked compared to what I expected it to actually be. So what we're going to do is we're going to be kind of giving you kind of the general specifications, kind of getting this thing going, as some of sort of the quirks of this plane, kind of everything leading up to the cruise. We'll kind of do all the cruising next time, and then we'll do a bunch of the kind of instrument/landing stuff the following. So the earlier versions of this aircraft, believe it or not, the 1956 version, the original OG Cessna 172, was actually powered by a Continental 0300. It was a pretty neat little engine. It was actually a six-cylinder engine, which might seem kind of surprising when people think about the Cessna 172. But believe it or not, there was a point where it was a Continental, then we got a Lycoming 320, the Cessna Lima version, that's 71. And of course, we got the Lycoming 360, which is the Romeo version in 1996. And a lot of people actually get a special type certificate for the Lima version, or I should say, the 0360 to get a little extra horsepower in this thing. Because originally, this thing was 140 horsepower, which isn't a lot for something that theoretically can hold people in the back seat, so to speak. So getting this thing started is a relatively straightforward process. And unfortunately, they designed this thing kind of old school here. And that's kind of a good thing. That's kind of a bad thing. On the earlier versions of the Cessna 172, we actually had a carbureted engine. Now, carbureted engines are kind of interesting. I just pushed the fuel valve in because we kind of need fuel. Carbureted engines were very funky. They're very annoying to work with. They kind of required you to do a lot of magic. We had carburetor icing problems where we had to constantly pull handles out when we reduced power, all that other stuff. But fortunately, we're a fuel-injected engine. Now, one of the things you'll notice absent from the which we had in the earlier versions here was actually the fact that we have a primer. We have no primer on board this particular aircraft, which surprises some folks, does not surprise people who fly fuel injection all the time, like Cirrus and stuff like that. What that means is we have to get fuel into the engine to kind of help with the starting process somehow. Fortunately, we have some tools for that purpose. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by going ahead and hitting the master switch here. Now, one of the things you probably noticed is the lights came on. And now the reason the lights came on, of course, is that you have these two little switches right here that are dedicated to your brightnesses. Now, one of the things they do for you to confuse the heck out of everybody is this switch also controls the backlights. You have to kind of be very mindful of that. And for us, we don't need that much of a glare shield. Another cool thing with the Cessna 172s, the earlier versions, is you actually had a little piece up here you could unscrew and pull out in order to let air flow. But believe it or not, what they have now is they have this more familiar kind of little valve here that you probably have seen before on airliners where you just kind of roll the thing upwards. Believe it or not, the airflow for this, in case you were curious, is there's a huge gap in the wing here. One of the things they don't tell you, of course, is the fact that this little gap in the wing allows things like birds to nest in there. So all the professionals out there will actually come in here, chuck a bunch of thin netting or something like that to basically discourage wildlife from getting into your airplane. Other airplanes, of course, you could cover these up as well when you weren't using them. But the key thing is you don't want a lot of junk to get stuck in there. One thing I think is kind of interesting here is there's no black scorch marks underneath where the exhaust is. This would be completely black normally. But again, that's a little detail that's just kind of interesting that people don't see. Now, if you're wondering what that is, that's actually a speaker. And one of the cool things is in the older aircraft, you actually had a separate speaker back here. And you can actually see this little plastic material here actually going up here that lets some of that air in for your folks in the back so they don't freeze. Now, one thing I think is really impressive with this version of the 172, if I can get in the back seat, come on, is the fact that they also go ahead and give us a handy-dandy light in the back seat. And it's actually kind of slick. This one doesn't work, but that's where that would be. And of course, you have a little speaker there if you want to listen in on things if we're on the radio. So one of the things we would do, of course, is we go ahead and climb in this plane. We kind of look around. We check to make sure everything off. Our avionics would always start off. It's a great way to kill the battery, by the way. It's also a good way to damage the avionics. But things we would do is, of course, we'd take the flaps handle and we'd push them all the way down. We'd climb outside. Excuse me, miss. You're right in my way. And the reason we do this, of course, is we want to make sure the flaps come down evenly when you set it. Earlier versions of the Cessna 172, believe it or not, had a gigantic, basically a lever in here, and you'd pull the lever towards you to engage the flaps mechanically. I love that system until you have to slap that and do 10 things at one time. Other things we do, of course, after setting oil flaps is we'd shut the power off inside, come down here, hit the two little switches, and we do our little walk around. Kind of come in, we give this thing a jiggle, 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 jiggle. We go underneath the ailerons, and of course, we tip them up. And I always tell people don't stick your fingers in here, but there's this little teeny, 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 tiny thing right here. You can't really see it where they actually connect the cable directly to the aileron, and it's very, very easy to break. So it's one of those things that you always kind of inspect. And of course, your static wicks would never look this nice; they'd be annihilated. This would be a time to check your pitot heat. This would be a time to check your elevator and everything else like that. One of the cool things is if you actually look at the back here, we're not an all-moving tail. Look at the size of the elevator on this thing. And you can also see the little trim tab chilling there on the side. You would come in here and check to make sure the trim setting is right, and then you come back and look at this to check the rigging and everything like that. You go through, one thing everybody loves doing is you have this little hatch right here. You go ahead and push this button. Well, in the real world, yeah, it's a button. You'd go ahead and pull it out, and you try to read the oil. You stick it in, pull it out again, check it. You go through here. You run your finger around the propeller blade, by the way, in case you're curious, about 75 to 76 inches. And one of the things that would always happen is like a little tiny rock would dent this, so you'd have to actually get the propeller dressed, as they would call it. And you check to make sure the filter's clean. There's no filter this clean in the world on a Cessna 172 that's not brand new. You look at the exhaust, make sure it's not going to fall out. Take a look inside, make sure nothing's living in there. Pull all your plugs out, and then you get back in. Of course, this is the point. One thing we can't see in this that we can in the real world is if I go underneath this, you're going to observe there's two seat adjustments. And again, like I said, we're doing an in-depth tutorial video here. So one of them, of course, you pull it up and go, and you can adjust the distance of your seat. And the other one, you sit here and rotate it for the purpose of adjusting the height of your seat. Now, one of the things you see in a good old-fashioned flight sim here is we're a mile away from the controls. You're probably sitting here going, wait, that's not close to the controls? No, you're probably sitting like this in the real plane. You're much, much closer, because what you don't see here is these two pedals down here are non-adjustable pedals. So that means you have to get to them regardless of where the yoke is. So if you have very, not that I'm particularly short, I'm very average actually, I'd have a real tough time reaching them from here. So I'd actually have to put my seat forward. So one of the fun things is when you land, of course, is you go and go back. And then if you take a look down here, there's these two holes where you plug in your headset. It will go and basically pull it out with you. And then it wraps around. Oh, it's a disaster every single time. Welcome to General Aviation, everyone. So what we do is we'd finish that up. Normally we would have is like if you have a briefing, you're flying with a flight instructor or something, they'd sit over here, but say, all right, we're ready to go, kind of a thing. You climb in here, you'd pull out the little basically knee board, whatever your kind of checklist is, you go through it. Basically, all you do for cold start here is I would go ahead and kick on the battery here. We turn on the beacon light. Purpose of the beacon light is to let everybody know behind you that we're getting started. The beacon light's this guy. I know it's a beacon light. It's bacon because it says BCN. I'm sorry, that's the beacon light as far as I'm concerned. After doing that, what you would do, of course, is you prime. Priming a 172S is a little different than the old ones. In the old days, you grab the primer and pull it out until you couldn't push it. But what we do is, unscientifically, is we crank the throttle like this and basically pop on the fuel pump. We're going to wait till fuel pump pressure peaks, which it did. We saw it over here. We pull that out, and then we pull the mixture out. Doesn't that feel wrong? So we're going to crack this just a little bit. So now there's enough fuel in there to actually start up. And once we do start, then we introduce the mixtures to actually get the rest of the engine kind of kissing after it. So what you do is you put your hand on the little key right here. You stick it in. By the way, you put the key in upside down 3 or 4 times. That's what you don't see here. We put our hand over here on the mixture. We'd be ready to go. We'd open up the window, which we can't do. Come on, man. And we yell out there, clear prop. We do one of these. We just look around, look around, look around, look around. Say, sounds pretty good to me. And we crank. That is the world's easiest starting Cessna 172. In my experience, the Cessna 172s that I've flown are much, much older. The engines are older, more they're Continentals or something like that, and they're pretty grumpy. So what we do, of course, is just like that, we get the thing started. We can let it run. Notice you shut the fuel pump off. We don't need it. One of the things we do, too, is a lot of times what you'll do is you set the fuel selector to one side and not the other. The reason for that, of course, and we'll get to that a little later on when we get to the next video, is it would be about trying to prevent cross-filling in the event that you had a leak or something like that. So after we get this thing started, of course, we'd lean the mixture like crazy. In the early days, of course, they'd say lean mixture in the manual, and I do this. No. Pull it back. If your RPM didn't drop, you didn't lean it hard enough. And the reason you do this, of course, is we have leaded fuel. And leaded fuel is a bad combo. So what I'm going to do now is I pop up the avionics master. That'd be kind of the next thing. You'd have your headphones on, by the way, and you hear the beep, depending on which version of the automatic pilot you have, depending on what Garmin you have. The one we fly, I would say traffic, and like go through all of its little kind of That's nice. Keep in mind, depending on the age of the airplane, of course, you may have different stuff. This is a very expensive setup that they have in here, so this is actually pretty sweet. Especially with an autopilot like this is nice. So, of course, what we do, too, is we pop on the transponder, and the next thing we do, of course, is check the weather in this particular plane. Of course, a million ways to check the weather. I set the weather default today. We could always go ahead and call up, a local ATIS or something like that. We could take a listen. That works really, really well for us. Generally, almost everything we do, and again, this is just what we do in the real world, is we'd always do any of that stuff on the secondary radio. That way, we never got in the way of who we're talking to. And also, you can hear both radios at the same time, which works really well for us. So, of course, the closest for us, we're in Ellington, Connecticut. In case you're curious, I'm going to pop that. We'd hit this and take a listen. Now, in the real world, you'd hear something, but here we don't, because it's a line of sight issue. You'd hear scratch, 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 Bradley, scratch, 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 and all those other kind of things. You'd listen to the radio, you'd know roughly what you need to do as far as places goes. Other thing we'd be looking for, of course, after we crank this thing over, is looking over our instruments. One thing you don't get here is there's no drama. See how the plane's perfectly still? You see how it does this little tiny crouch it does once in a while? This plane, it's not that it would be bad, but it would be like this at this RPM normally. Not a big deal. But one of the fun things is all the needles would be dancing to give you an idea just mechanically how they are. This gauge would just be going, whoa, because it's float based on the older types. And we come down here, we just check to make sure everything looks okay, and that'd be perfectly fine and good to go. So the next step, of course, would be to get this thing going. Of course, we'd retract wing flaps. We'd go double check everything. We'd make sure we're not going to run anybody over. We'd want to get on the local radio, just to kind of give everybody a heads up. 1229 which is kind of be the local, not too bad. So, of course, 90, just going to pop up here, just like that. And, of course, in the real world, you never get, sometimes you get radios that are this nice. A lot of times you just have to kind of work at it. No big deal, kind of a thing like that. And, of course, this is a CTAF frequency, so everybody shares it, which means you can hear everybody when you're actually talking on it, which is kind of fun, but kind of bad. So what we do now, of course, is we get everything, we make our calls, everything like that. And then we get to Cessna 172 quirk number 15 here. And that's the fact that our nose wheel steering is not what you think of with nose wheel steering. Now, what you think is these are mechanically connected to the front wheel. They're not mechanically connected to the front wheel. As a matter of fact, if you look, I am cranking on them, and the front wheel is doing nothing at all. It's like doing nothing at all. Nothing at all. And the reason it's like that is because when you push these pedals, you're actually pulling a spring. That spring tugs on this wheel to actually encourage it to go in a specific direction. So one of the interesting things is the amount that I can deflect my pedal here does not necessarily correspond directly with the amount that this wheel will turn. It's just kind of one of those, Now, if you're on a Cessna 182, they use the same system, and it sucks. Now, here's a bonus question. When you're in the air, if you play with the rudder pedals, does this wheel turn? No, because it actually mechanically disconnects from itself when it gets in the air. Nice little touch. Good job, Cessna. Good job. Good job. So what we do, of course, is we disengage it. In the real world, as soon as I pull the brake off, the thing starts to go forward. I've never played a flight sim that get that right yet. I think DCS maybe got that kind of right in the big Warbirds, but in my flight sim, it's like, stomp. I should not have to push it that hard. Now, the way this would work, of course, is I kick look at how hard I'm kicking it all the way, and then I can kick it as hard as I want this way, and just watch it go, I'll get back to you on that. Hang on a second. So the one thing we don't see, of course, in the real world is we have differential braking. I don't have differential braking. And the reason I don't have differential braking is because I have these kind of like soft pedals that go with the rest of my kit here. Great for helicopters, by the way. Garbage for GA, especially garbage for over two planes. So I don't have the ability to turn this thing at a dime. But to give you an idea of how tightly you can turn this thing, let's go ahead and get myself right here. In the real plane, I would be completely confident of being able to do a 180-degree turn without touching grass, just to give you an idea of how fast and how hard you can snap this thing. I could try to do one of these, kind of crank on it like that, basically pulling pressure off the wheel. But notice I still go cutting into the grass here just a tiny bit. I would not have that problem in the real plane, just to give you an idea. So anyway, after we did all that, of course, we'd make our way up to wherever we're going to be taxiing and taking off from, and we do our classic little run. Yeah, this plane, Flight Sim just has this wrong. It's just not what it is. It is not what the idle on this plane is. It's not how sluggish the engine. None of those are correct. So I'm going to go ahead and tap the brake here, give myself a little bit of gas, and get up to 1,000. Run up is very easy. The one thing I always forgot to do in my early days is that. It's pretty embarrassing when you don't do that. You kind of need that. And all we're doing here is testing a couple things. So what we do is we push it in. We wait for about 1,800 RPM. Like I said, it takes almost no effort in the real plane to get this thing up to 1,800. And it looks pretty good right about there. Hey, not bad. So what we do, of course, is we check all our instruments, make sure they're in the green, which they are. Then we go ahead and do our classic magneto check. You're looking for 75. That's about 125. Pretty typical. That's actually not a great magneto. Let it come back up. We'll come down to the right magneto, and it says about 125. There's no more than 50 difference between the two. That's pretty good. These are pretty bad magnetos. We're probably getting close to replacing there. We can almost not fly that. So after that, of course, we check our vacuum, make sure everything else is good, and then we'd make our way over to the runway. Now, one of the reasons I picked this airfield today is because it's one of the shortest runways in the state of Connecticut. It actually is the shortest runway in the state of Connecticut. And that's awesome for us because it's going to give us an opportunity to really demonstrate what this plane is all about. One thing you'll probably observe is the fact that we have half a tank. So we're not very heavy, which makes this a little bit easier. So taking off in the Cessna 172, the earlier versions, if you're looking at like a November version or earlier, you actually were recommended not to take off with any flaps, even for short field. The reason being is any benefit you got for getting off the ground, you lost in climb. But this version of the Cessna 172, I'm going to just kind of do some quick ground handling here. This version of the 172, of course, with 180 horsepower, actually has the ability to take advantage of that extra drag and actually power through it, kind of a thing. So takeoff on this, we're allowed to use up to 20 degrees, which is quite a bit of flaps for us. 10 degrees is a much safer. It's kind of like a compromise between the two, so to speak. Now, the first time you take off in a Cessna 172, I remember my first journey, especially with my first solo, is just how much vibration this thing creates. You think it's loud, then it gets loud, and then it gets loud. After that, of course, you let go of the brakes and it goes, and it never leaves the ground when you expect it. And the real reason for that in sims is because you probably never set your takeoff trim correctly. Now, if it's just somebody in the front seat, one of the things they teach you to do is to actually put the letter O in takeoff and not the arrow, and that really makes it easy. We're looking for a speed of 55 knots here. So we're going to do short field, stand on the brakes, full power. See how there's see how it didn't crouch a lot? That's a little different, but see how it's bouncing a bit? That's better. So we let go, and the book says actually what we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and compensate for the crosswind. We're going to pull back just a tiny bit. We don't need to pull back a lot here. It takes very little, and the plane will start getting very loose on you, especially with those 10 degrees of flaps. And there it goes. You'll notice it just kind of goes on its own now. Now, one of the things you might not have known about a Cessna 172 is the engine is not evenly mounted down the center line of the airplane. It's actually canted to help reduce the effect of all those left-turning tendencies of an airplane once you get airborne. Now, you notice we're very slow here. We're basically doing a VX climb. So what I'm going to do now, and this would have been a newbie mistake for me many years ago, is I actually want to nose down, then bring the flaps up. If you just jam the flaps up, the plane goes, and basically wallows. So the next step, of course, is to get us at our VY, which is basically 75. A lot of people kind of in the early days of flight sim automatically think that the correct speed is whatever the book says. And for a general rule, the book is generally right. But remember, book speeds were always based on a maximum takeoff plane. So one of the things we can actually do is we can take advantage of the fact we're not as heavy, and we can actually adjust our climb speed to actually get a little more bang out of our buck here if that's something that we wanted to achieve, which for us is not necessarily something we want to achieve. So normally with this plane, of course, is we make all our communications right when we get to about 1,000 feet or so. I'll go ahead and bring the nose down. The other thing, of course, we'd want to do after we get this all set up is we continue climb. This is not a complex aircraft in many ways. But the key thing here is it's just a matter of just keeping that power in to enjoy that and kind of keeping us around 75 knots. Regardless of what version of this plane, it was always between 70 and 75 knots. The version that I used to fly was actually in miles an hour. So, 85 miles an hour worked pretty well for me. And I've never seen a 172 in kilometers an hour. It's not to say that they don't have them in kilometers per hour. It's just to say I've never seen it. So that's going to pretty much get us up to our altitude. Our cruise altitude today is going to be very low. We're traveling to the west here, which would be even plus thousands under 3,000. So we're going to go ahead and climb up to 4,500 feet here. And now we'll go ahead and skip that part. Okay, so we're getting pretty close to 4,000 feet. Now, one of the things the book talks to you about in the 172, and my own experiences in the 172, is as you start to climb, you're going to progressively start losing power. The book actually refers to specifically once you cross that 3,000 feet line, you're really going to start feeling the plane going, I don't know. So one of the things you actually have to do is you have to lean your mixture on the way up. Now, the best thing about leaning the mixture on the way up is you can feel it working because you hear the engine go, and it actually will get louder on you. So looking down here at my RPM, you can actually see as I'm pulling the mixture out, you can see it instantly having impact on my RPM. See how the RPM starts to climb? Keep pulling back, and see how many RPMs I got, and that's how nice that is. Now, in the real world, of course, we listen for it, and that would be the clue. It goes, Again, that's a technical term for it starting to get a little stuttery on me. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and end our video. I think this has been a pretty good introduction, really getting you to think a little bit about this plane and kind of the minutia is what I'm going to call it. We'll pick up basically from our climb and then to our crews on the next video. Enjoy.